Everyone to our Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Professor Jennifer Dill. I'm a professor of urban studies and planning and director of TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center that sponsors this. And I'm very happy today to be introducing Dr. Marilyn Johnson, who is a senior research fellow with the Institute of Transportation Studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. So she's come a long way, probably one of our furthest. We've had some other visitors from Monash, and that's probably about as far as we've had a speaker come from. Sorry, I have the notes very small on my tiny little old iPhone. She is also the Research and Policy Manager at the Amy Gillett Foundation, also in Australia. Her research expertise is in cycling, including cyclist safety, cyclist-driver interactions, and electric bike use in Australia. And she currently holds a DECRA, which is an acronym that stands for something lovely, I'm sure, fellowship from the Australian Research Council, and she is currently on about a 2-week trip to various parts of the U.S., and I convinced her that she has to stop in Portland if she's interested in cycling. And so we took her out for about a 3-hour bike ride throughout Portland yesterday as an introduction. So welcome, Marilyn, and I'm going to let you. So she has a presentation. Hold your questions till towards the end, and we should have time. And take it away. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that, Jennifer. Hi. Thanks for the introduction. As Jennifer mentioned, I do have 2 jobs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. It's not. What I just wanted to understand first was, from everyone in the room, how many people here are sort of students or at the sort of beginning of your career? Can I just get you to put your hands up? Oh, a few. Okay, cool. So there might be some insights from, oh, hi. No?
Could you speak up a little bit?
Oh, you want me to speak louder? Okay, I'll try. I'll try to speak loudly and slowly with my Australian accent, which can get fast and slow. I'll try. So first, a bit of a disclaimer. I am a cyclist, and I like to ride this type of bike, if this clicker is going to work. Nope.
Oh, sorry, guys.
That's all right. I can do it from here. That's fine. That's my bike. That's not usual in Australia, but I can see in Portland that it's not uncommon for you guys to ride like an upright city bike. That's not usually the case in Australia. Most of our cyclists will ride a road bike, wear a lot of lycra, and it's typically that sort of strong and fearless end of the cycling cohort that we have in Australia. This is not as common. And generally, we ride in areas kind of like that. A lot of bike lanes that kind of start, that stop. We ride with mixed traffic a lot. And so that's usually what my commute will look like. Parts in the cycling infrastructure and parts of it will be out. But my main riding that I really like to do looks kind of more like that. I ride that same upright bike, long distances with my friends in small groups, unsupported rides, and we ride a fair way. So we rode from Melbourne to Sydney on one of those rides, which is kind of like riding from Portland to Sacramento. So it's on open roads, it's on high speeds. So the riding is really quite challenging in those situations, but locally and more metro, it's a lot like Portland. Riding around yesterday, it kind of felt the same.
I'm so sorry.
That's okay, you can do that now. I'm ready. So as Jennifer mentioned, I am at Monash University, which is in Melbourne, in Australia. And it's a relatively young university in sort of international sense. It was established in 1958. It's one of the largest universities in Australia. It's about 60,000 students. And it's usually ranked in the top 100 universities on different rankings around the world. The reason it suits me so well is that the person that the university was named after, Sir John Monash, he was an engineer, he was a public administrator, he'd served in the military, and he was someone who really had a sense that learning is not just for us as individuals, but it's for how we can benefit the entire community. And that sits really well with me because that's kind of my approach to research as well. Within Monash, I'm part of the Monash Institute of Transport Studies, and this group was formed in the late 1960s. It's got an aim to contribute to the development of safe and sustainable transportation, and there's 4 different streams. So intelligent transport, future transport, public transport, and this bottom corner here, that's where I sit in active transport. And I co-lead that group with our director, Professor Jeff Rose, who is a big fan of Portland. He's been here quite a few times. I've seen your big oversized yellow cup from Powell's bookshop, and he likes to tease me that he has more tea than me because of that cup, but I didn't buy one when I went there yesterday. The other group that I work with is the Amy Gillett Foundation. So 3 days a week I'm at Monash, where I'm a senior research fellow. 2 days a week I'm at the foundation. Amy Gillett was a professional athlete. She went to the Olympics as a rower, and she transitioned from there into cycling. And she was riding with the Australian cycling team in Germany on a training ride when she was involved in a crash where she was killed. Her other teammates were quite seriously injured, and it was after her death that her family and friends formed the foundation. And the sole purpose of the foundation is to improve cycling safety. That's it. They want to create a safe cycling environment for everyone in Australia, for every type of ride, on every road, for every person. It's a not-for-profit, and it takes an evidence-based approach to the action. So for me, it's an easy fit between the 2 different areas. And the reason I'm involved with the foundation is that they were the providers of my scholarship when I did my PhD. So I've continued to work with them in the years since. The third hat that I have is with the Australasian College of Road Safety. This is the peak road safety organisation in Australia. It links all of the road safety professionals in Australia and New Zealand. And it's a way for us to share the momentum that we have collectively as a group to advocate to keep road safety on the political agenda, both federally and at a state level. There's an annual conference that we had in Sydney 2 weeks ago, and there are chapter seminars. I'm the chair of the chapter in Victoria and the vice president of the organisation nationally. And the idea really is to see if we can sort of create more change together. That slide's a bit of a fake. There's no way my life is that neat in these 2 roles. So if the blue circle is all the Monash stuff and the pink circle is all the Amy Gillett Foundation stuff, that's kind of how they overlap together. The continuum at the bottom has research at this end and practice at the other. The overlap is really where the cycling safety fits in both roles, but there's work on either side that isn't related to either organisation. It really is quite a messy way to work, but it's also a way to keep my involvement both in research and practice, and one continues to inform the other. The research informs the actions of the foundation, but that action also identifies gaps in the research, which then informs research questions, and it keeps kind of going around. The way that the college fits in is that it sort of captures all of that and helps to bring it all together and share it with the broader road safety community. And that's my goal. That's why I go to work every day. That's why I have all these different roles. My pure aim in all of this is to prevent trauma on the roads. There's lots and lots of ways that we can be hurt or be killed, and I just don't think that traveling on the road in any mode should be one of them. So in terms of the sort of the schematic approach of how I see the research landscape in Australia anyway, is that these things seem quite clear. So on the left we have research. That's pretty clear. You've got a research team, you have your partner organisations, you work together, you get your findings. There might be some PhD, some peer-reviewed journal articles, some conference papers. So that happens here. Over here, we have the practice, and the list of organisations there are the key stakeholders in Victoria who I would normally deal with. And they're the people actually doing the work that leads to the action out on the road. But the dashed line, the orange line at the top, is because there's often that disconnect between the research and the practice. We don't necessarily do that well in road safety in Australia. We do each of these areas well, but we don't tend to connect them. Then you've got the international stuff, what's going on everywhere else in the world, and how does that fit in? And so that's really where I sit, in that translation space in between the 2. One of the ways that we translate the research that we do is to get people out into the space that we're researching. This is some footage from June this year, where we had just finished a major research study, and we took the international experts that we invited over to Australia out on a bike ride, much like the one we took yesterday. There might be a familiar face for you in there. Jennifer's on that ride with us. And also, I've included it here to give you a sense of what it's like to ride in Melbourne. You can see there's lots of different types of infrastructure. It's a real mix. Some of the stuff that's similar to here in Portland, and definitely some of the photos I took yesterday will inform some of the changes we'd like to see. But what we did was we got to the end of our research study. We wanted to run some kind of workshop, but we weren't quite sure the format that we should use. So it's such a pretty part of the city to ride. I'll let you watch it. But I won't. So what we did is we had the e-bike ride, then we had a facilitated workshop. And this was a place for us as researchers to really sit down and not pretend that we could facilitate this ourselves, because the preference for researchers in Australia is to do what I'm doing right now, tell you the information, and you just sit there and passively listen. But we knew for that study it wasn't going to work. So we took our experts from the international experts out on a ride. We brought them into the room, having that greater familiarity with the Melbourne area. And then we all engaged in a workshop for that day where we presented the research findings. We had this facilitated workshop with the local community decision makers who could really actually change the practices on the road. And then from that, we elicited from them a list of priority actions. So people left the room that day with an action for the short term and the longer term and what we could do next. And this is what we came away from that workshop with. So we now have 30 people in Melbourne who are committed to these actions. So what we found, whilst we had a research project that had a lot of information, we were too far down the track as researchers in wanting that action to happen now. What that workshop taught us was that we actually need to come all the way back and bring our senior decision makers along with us. They don't have a really good business case in Melbourne for installing more cycling infrastructure. So we need to not just talk in the language of their analysis, so cost-benefit ratios or analysis, but we also need to do that in a way that's bite-sized, so that it's not the reams and reams of scientific research that we think is important, because obviously for the decision makers in Melbourne, it's not. The other major gap that we have is that we do not have a lot of cycling safety design in our undergraduate civil engineering curriculum. Yet that's the pathway to being someone who designs the infrastructure on the roads in Australia. So there's a commitment from those people who are in the room to work on how we can include that. And some of the discussions that I had yesterday, there might be some opportunities to do that in collaboration with some of the work you guys are doing here in Portland. And then the coalition of the mayors, giving them the elevator pitch. Again, it's that link from the research to the practice and us being responsible for translating our work so that it's usable to the practitioners. But we didn't let our international guests get away for free. We also had a public seminar where they each presented their work. And what that did was it gave us an opportunity to open up this topic area to the public and to showcase our researchers, the research that was going on at Monash, both staff and students. So I suppose for those of you who put your hand up earlier that this is something that you're starting out with in your career, I just want you to really take away from this part that the 3 parts of this seminar, this isn't something that's standard to Monash. This is something that we created, that we decided that we needed for the group that we were talking to. And I suppose what I would hope that you would take from this is that if you have an idea about how to engage people in a way that's a little bit more creative or a little bit more unusual than the way things are normally done, then I would encourage you to do that. People can only really say no. And luckily for us, they didn't. This part of the format in itself took about 4 months worth of work to put together. By the time we decided the route, we had all kinds of issues with legal waivers, with insurances, but it was well worth it because for the international guests who arrived that afternoon, they just saw a ride, they just saw the experience, and they hopped off at the end, and we had beer and pizza and talked about what we'd seen. The other really good thing about including this routing, this map sort of where we would ride with the local decision makers is it was another point for them to buy into. And we had asked them, what are the highlights and the lowlights you want us to show these international people? So they already had identified places that they wanted us to stop. And in particular, there's a really nasty point at one end of a street in Melbourne, which is a major thoroughfare for trams, cars and cyclists. And we spent quite a bit of time there checking that out. And we could then take that learning into the workshop. But in the overview for this presentation, I said that I would give you a bit of a speed dating tour of some of the research that's going on that we're involved in cycling. So I'm going to do this across 9 different projects, and hopefully I've given myself enough time. So the first one I'm going to start with is, this is my major research study. This is what I spend my time doing. The fellowship that Jennifer mentioned at the beginning, the DECRA, it's an early career research fellowship. It's a fellowship from the federal government that means that I can do research full time. And this is what I'm looking at. Every year in Australia, we have medical legal death investigations for every single road fatality crash in the country. It costs about $12 billion to conduct those investigations. And this is everything from when the police arrives on the scene at a crash, witness statements from the counterpart driver, statements from the family or the friends of the deceased person, all the way through to the outcome, and whether that goes through the criminal court or the coroner's court with some findings. While that's a really, really important, rich and detailed data set, it's one that hasn't been well utilised to understand road fatality crashes in Australia. It's been really well used to understand other mechanisms of death, including drowning and falls, but we haven't done such a good job with transport. So that's the aim of this study, is to understand the utility and impact of those coronial investigations on road safety policy, practice and prevention of fatalities. And as I said, it's a 5-year study. It's going to take a really long time. We're just at the start of it. But we're looking at everything from whether there were pre-existing social determinants to the people who were involved in the crash event. So had someone had an argument? Had there been other socioeconomic issues? Have I knocked that? Is that why that's wobbling? Sorry. There's a wobble going on. All the way through to how the coroner's recommendations are being used or not being used in public policy. And this is probably the easiest way to explain it really simply. We understand the right side of that diagram. So from the death, there's an investigation. And from the investigation, it either goes to one of the 2 different court systems, either to the coroner's court or to the criminal court. So that right side we know. The dash side is what we don't know, and that's the focus of the research. We don't know what a recommendation from the coroner's court or a recommendation from the criminal court, we don't know how that impacts public policy, and we don't know if that impact, the pathway of that impact to public policy has a reduction effect on fatalities. So that's the focus of the research for the next 5 years. That's what pays for the majority of my role at Monash, and that's why I've had to broaden my research interest, because it's quite hard to find research funding for full time on just a small single road user area. So having it just on cycling wasn't going to work. So I needed to broaden that. And if you're interested in doing research as a full-time career, I'm happy to talk to you about how you need to balance that research funding mix. I'll leave that one for now, but I'm happy to talk about any of these in much more detail. I'll move on to the next one, which is Cycle Aware. This is a really, really cool project that I'm really excited about, because we've had some clear impacts. We're much further down the line with this one. Cycle Aware is a collaborative project between Monash University, Dr. Jennifer Bonham at the University of Adelaide, and Professor Narelle Howarth from CARS-Q in Queensland. That photograph's taken in Adelaide, and you can see that's another example of the sort of second tier road user infrastructure we have for cyclists. The white line that's here, that's under the car, that's the bike lane. But for these guys, they're clearly out there after 10 o'clock in the morning, because it becomes a parked car, like a parking lane after those bike lane hours. So from 7 to 10, it's clear you can ride in that little bit there. But then from 10 till 3, that's where the cars are going to be parked. So one of the reasons that we wanted to conduct this study was because that is an example of how the infrastructure of the road itself is pushing cyclists and drivers together. And it happens a lot in Australia. We mix use a lot. But what we weren't really clear about is, how do drivers learn to do that safely? What's the process? So we decided to start with the driver education process, and we started in the Australian capital, again, pragmatically, because they have a research trust that we can use to access some funding. The tiny little blue sort of oval shape in the bottom corner there, that's the Australian Capital Territory. It's the political capital of Australia, and it's where we did this first piece of research. What we did was we reviewed every piece of government documentation about how you get a driver license in the ACT. Everything that goes to the driver, to the supervising driver, to the professional driving instructors. Jennifer conducted that review, and then I sat in on the driver training courses. We used deception in this study. We didn't tell them why we were there. They thought we were there just to understand how people learn to drive in the ACT. They didn't know us about cycling. And then I spent a week in the backseat of the car with learner drivers as they did their driving lessons with professional driving instructors. That was a challenging week. It's not a job that I would want, but I respect the people who do it. One guy in particular, he patiently sat through a learner driver trying to do a handbrake start, like a hill start in a manual car on a quite a steep hill. She had 52 attempts and she just rode his clutch. I think he needed a new one by the end of it. But my purpose in being in the backseat of the car, again, they thought that I was generally trying to see how they were taught to drive, but what I was looking for was for mentions of cycling, and there were virtually none. And what we learned from this study is that effectively in Australia, we teach the test. I don't know if it's the same here, but if it's not on the test, pretty much you're not going to get mentioned in the way we teach. Oh, I'm getting some nods. Okay, it's the same here. So what we were able to do from that study is actually inform a change to the test. So from August in 2016, there's now a new element to the test in the ACT. They are now tested for information about vulnerable road users. So it's about cyclists, it's about pedestrians. It's about things like, do they open the door and check before they get in and out of the car? Are they doing head checks before they turn, for us it's turn left? And are they looking ahead for cyclists and for pedestrians? So we can actually test that now. What we then did after that, though, is we were so enthusiastic about the success of this that we've scaled this up to a national study. And we went back to the Australian Research Council, and we this time had a collection of organisations who partnered with us. They're government, they're non-government, and importantly in this study, they're from the two of the smaller states, not geographically smaller, but in terms of population. So most of our partners come from South Australia, with also the Northern Territory government. And that's been a really unexpected but valuable sort of experience for us. We thought we needed to be in the more populated eastern states of Victoria and New South Wales. But what we're finding in South Australia and the Northern Territory is that they are really, really willing to try things. So an extension of the work that we did in the ACT, we're now developing a cycle aware module to add to the learner driver process that people are going through, which is increasingly online. And the Northern Territory and the South Australian government will be trialling that for us in January and February of next year. So what we'll get by the end of this project is an evaluated module that we can say to the rest of the states, this is what you need to do if you want to teach drivers about sharing the road safely with cyclists. So that's all I've got for that study, and I'll leave it with you to have a look at the website if you're interested in more information. The publications and details about that study are online. Keep going. The next one that I want to talk to you about are the left turns. So you guys can do the translation, you know, I mean the right turn for you guys here. But this study is about the cyclist going straight and the driver turning across their path. In 2014, I want to say, the Victorian State Road Authority, Vic Roads, conducted a survey of the road rules related to cycling to the Victorian population. They had 14,000 people respond, both cyclists and drivers. That interaction in terms of the road rules was one of the least understood negotiations. People just don't know what to do. So this prompted a study from one of our final year students, Hugo Nichols. This was his final research project, and he worked on three elements of this, sort of the design, the road rules, and the behaviour, the safety element to this. And what he found, and if I just will check that, okay. What he found is that really there's two elements. There's sort of this 2x2 table represents it quite well. There's two things going on. There's the legal behaviour and there's the safe behaviour, and there's the intersection between the two. So where it's legal and safe makes sense, that's all fine. We're not worried about that. But where behaviour is safe but illegal, that's an area that we're not quite sure what needs to change. Is it that we need to change the road design, or do we actually need to change the road rule? And similarly, where it's legal but it's unsafe, again, we're setting people up to behave in ways that people who get quite righteous and say, I'm in the right, but it's not safe. So what you can see from the video there is the car will approach the stop line. This continuous lane suggests or says to the rider they should stay left. But of course, to go left means they put themselves in the path of that turning car. And what you'll see happens is they kind of just swarm all around them. We see gender differences. We see that women are much more likely to stay to the left or stay behind. The guys are a bit more likely to go to the right. And it also, there's a platooning effect. So the more people that there are on the road, the more likely the driver is to give way, when in fact a driver turning left doesn't need legally to give way to the cyclist. So I'll just let this. So that cyclist really should have waited for that car. So there's a bit of that mixed back and forth. This is an example of maybe just a cyclist's behaviour. Because that you guys will recognise, that's a tram line. So he got really, really close to that. So finding ways that we can improve this whole interaction is the focus of this research. So Hugo's work that he did as a final year student has been extended. We've now observed 7 more infrastructure types, and we're continuing that analysis now. But what Hugo found in his work was he had looked at 4 different infrastructure types. And what we used we used the variability of the way that the cyclists approach the car as a proxy for predictability or for safety. And what we found was that the cyclist position in relation to the turning motor vehicle at those sites that had continuous infrastructure, either to the stop line or across the intersection, really, really high predictability. There was low variability. So pretty much everyone was going where we expected to. But here, where the infrastructure stopped at mid-block and we had this interpretive dance space between the mid-block infrastructure and the intersection, I think you guys here will call it the mixing zone, lots of variation. And what that does, and we know from the surveys we've done with drivers, is it makes drivers feel really uncomfortable. They just aren't sure where cyclists are going to be or what they should do. And it was a study that came out of TRL in London from I think early 2000s that referred to drivers having an impatient caution. And that's really what they have in Melbourne. So that study's been extended even further, and now there's a collaboration on all those 3 different parts. So I'm now working with Hugo, with the State Road Authority, and now we're combining with Monash Law and the Monash University Art, Design and Architecture to work out how we can change these things. And we've got a project now with local government where we're going to use a living lab to test some new designs to see what actually works on the road. So we've started that with our collaboration with some Lego, of course, that's how you start collaborations. And what we were doing with this workshop was we were saying to the local council members, how can we change this? What can we do? How do you want us to be involved, and where can we do this? And so the plan here is that in February and March next year, which for us is sort of peak cycling time, it's warm, it's summer, we're going to put some of this infrastructure down on the road and do a before and after evaluation to see if it improves the predictability of that turning behaviour. And concurrently, we have Vanessa Johnston, who is working on the review of the law, and Dr. Robbie Napper is leading that one from MARTA. E-bikes. E-bikes in Australia is an interesting one. Up until 2012, we had an oddity in our design regulation that meant that we had a limitation on our power output to 200 watts. So while the rest of the world was making electric bikes at 250 watts, we were not able to import them, buy them, get them legally because we had this limitation. So we did a study on e-bike use in 2012 to find out how many people were riding them. And just after we finished that survey, they changed the regulation and put it up to 250 watts, and suddenly we had a completely different cohort on our hands. So we repeated that survey in 2015, and the survey that we ended up doing there, we looked at the safety implications of e-bikes, and it was a replication of the survey that we'd done in 2012, but keeping in mind that the regulation had changed. And some of the main safety gains that we found from that study are listed here. Low rider fatigue was a big one with electric bikes. People who originally were saying, I don't want to ride because I don't want to get too far away from my home and I can't get back because I'm tired, were saying now they feel comfortable to finish their trips. People aren't worried about hills, they can maintain their speeds, and they felt that the e-bike was a way for them to avoid a crash because they could kind of just power out of that space. They felt a little bit more stable, and the geometry came up as being a safety feature, but that's largely because in Australia we ride a lot of sort of bikes where you'd lean forward more, so either road bikes or flat bar bikes, whereas the geometry of an e-bike is more like a town bike where you'd sit up. And often for some people, this is the first time they've ridden a bike of that geometry. People liked that they had integrated bike lights and they felt more confident. The thing for me that I've been doing research with cyclists for more than 10 years, and this is the way that I would represent e-bike riders. That's what they look like. They're not little kids, but that's when you talk to an e-bike rider, they're so excited. They love their e-bike. They think it's fantastic. They think it's the best thing that they've ever ridden. So for us, it's really a stepping stone for some people to get out of their car. They can't quite get to a bike, or they've been on a bike and they've been injured, or they're feeling that they're not quite up to it anymore and they're coming back to an e-bike. I know that's not the case in, say, the Netherlands, where people are worried that they'll have reduced physical activity, but in Australia, it's definitely going the other way. One of the other things we looked at in that study was looking at the electric bike characteristics and performance in relation to bike facility design criteria. And this is the infrastructure section of this work. And there's really clear differences in the needs for people who are on e-bikes compared to on pedal bikes. And it mainly relates to speed and experience, but also the age of the riders. In Australia, many of our e-bike riders are slightly older than our normal cycling cohort. And with that age, sometimes comes experience. Sometimes these are lifelong cyclists who've now hopped off onto e-bikes. But it's also people who've been on a holiday. Often they go to China. They see a lot of people on e-bikes and they come home and they think, I'm going to get an e-bike. They haven't been on an e-bike for decades and they hop on and they're traveling much faster speed than you would be able to reach if you're on a pedal bike for the fitness level that they have. So it's a lens that we need to keep in mind, that people need to think about the experience of these riders riding at these speeds, because some of the turns, particularly on off-road paths in Australia, are quite tight, and we find that people are coming off as they take those corners. I'll leave that one there, and I just want to show you two projects from two of my PhD students that they're working on. The first one's from Taru. Taru's looking at her broader PhD research is about shared mobility, but this paper that she did is on the bike share system in Melbourne, which was unsuccessful, spectacularly unsuccessful. And one of the things that's quite often quoted for why cycling is not more popular in Australia is because of the helmet law that we have. We have mandatory helmet use legislation. But in fact, for the bike share scheme, it was because it's had incredibly low density. So the green circles there represent the sort of 300-metre buffer around each of the bike station pods, and it's really low. It's one of the lowest in the literature that we can find internationally. And what we found is over time, the little chart on the right there, is that the usage was changing from long-term subscribers, so local people, to casual riders, so tourists. And you can tell from some of the location, so the origin destination data, that the casual riders, so this in Melbourne is the Bay. So people are much more likely to ride down to the beach, ride along. It's a coastal road. It's very scenic. It's very pretty, compared to the local users who are much more likely to stay in the CBD. So density had definitely one contributing factor to the lack of success of the shared scheme. But the second thing was a policy decision that the city decided that they would make trams in that sort of rectangular space there on the right. They would make the trams free. So right in the area where all the shared bikes were, suddenly you could get on a tram for free all day. And Melbourne's a little bit hilly in those areas. So what had already been happening was that the bikes were going from the top end to the bottom end and being left, but now people weren't getting on them at all. So that broader policy issue is really the reason why that scheme struggled. And so Tauru's moved her PhD focus away from bike shares to looking at how the gig economy and how ride share interacts with public transport, given the failure of the bike share scheme. Moving on now to Hasara's work. Hasara is looking at bicycle access to train stations. So he's looking at why people do and don't ride to the train station in Melbourne. This map here, these red lines are all the train lines out from the centre of Melbourne's in here, train lines go all the way out. The black dots are the train stations. He's done some intercept surveys with people who were riding to the train station. They found that secure bike parking correlated quite strongly with the value of your bike, and that was really the only determining factor in where you would park it at the station. But generally, we had a fairly low level of ridership to the train station in Australia. People are much, much more likely to drive, even if they live quite close. So he's done some modelling here to create catchment areas around the train station, because the next part of his PhD is interested on the potential mode shift. So how do we get people out of their car and onto a bike, or potentially to, probably on their bike. They're not going to walk. Some of them live too far away. And we've used the 4 types of cyclists that come from Portland, so from Roger Geller's work, but we've made a 5th. So I hope I don't offend anyone in the room by my 4 types of cycling being 5. But we have 5. So what he's done is he's done some intercept surveys with all commuters. He's used a systematic sampling framework where he handed out, we used undergraduate students to help us out there, but they've handed out a postcard inviting them to respond to a survey to almost 4,000 commuters. So they've handed out to every 7th person who came off the train at 13 different stations. They've then replied and talked about the mode that they've used to get to the train station that day, and not surprisingly, there was an oversampling of the cyclists compared to what we did when we intercepted them here, and they were counted as a number of people arriving to the station. What's really cool about his work, though, is it's showing that here, this is where most of the people live. So this is our new group, our 5th from the 4 types. They're not down here. The majority of people are not the no way, no how, I don't want to ride. And they're not even that interested but concerned. They're somewhere in between that group and the enthused and confident. They're pretty enthusiastic, but they're just not confident. So the question there for us is, what do we need to do to help people be more confident about riding to the train station? Because what Hasara's work is showing is that we asked the people in that group where their cross-section was of the 2 roads closest to their home, so we had an idea of how close they lived to the intersection, how close they lived to the train station, and the majority of them, 67%, lived within the catchment area that he was able to define. And so that varies from about sort of 3 to 5 up to about 8 kilometres. So it's something that's definitely rideable. So then the question at the end towards his PhD will be, how do we get some of these people to shift further across and potentially to ride? I'm going to leave the research there for a minute. I'm going to move on to some of the work with the Amy Gillett Foundation and 3 projects in particular. The first one is the main project that the foundation's been working on for the last 8 or 9 years or so, and that's A Metre Matters. So as I mentioned already, most of us ride on the road, and that interacting with cars is something that is a real barrier to non-cyclists. Talking back to Hasara's work, that's probably undermining some of the confidence. People just don't want to get in and mix it up with traffic. One of the things that we found is that this lateral clearance is a problem. People don't like being passed closely by cars. And the legislation that we had around how much space drivers needed to give cyclists was incredibly vague. It said that drivers needed to allow sufficient passing distance. No one was ever quite sure what sufficient meant. And from the cyclists we spoke to, it pretty much meant they didn't hit me. Now, at 60 kilometres an hour, someone passing you within, if you could touch their car, that's uncomfortable, that's too close, and it's obviously a barrier. There was a guideline in the driver licensing handbook that they needed to give a metre when drivers overtook cyclists, but that wasn't something that was really happening out on the road, and certainly observational studies were showing that. So the foundation set up a campaign that lasted for a really long time, talking about giving at least 1 metre. That was everywhere. That campaign was from 2009 to about 2013, until it was tested in court. There was a young guy, Richard Pollitt was his name. He was 22, he was a violinist, and he was riding a bike in Brisbane when he was approached from behind by a guy who was driving a cement truck. And the guy in the truck thought that he had sufficient distance, and he went to overtake Richard, and he didn't have sufficient distance. He hit Richard, and Richard was killed. And when that case went to court, the driver was found not guilty, particularly in relation to this road rule, because he had thought he had sufficient distance. And whilst it's not the most serious offence, we felt that there was a really strong and important education message that needed to come out around making this law more specific. And so we then changed the action of the foundation to purely focus on this to get some change. I'm not expecting you to read this next slide, but this is an overview of the work that it took and the time to change the law in Australia. So action from parliamentary committees all the way back in 2013, getting through to having the reviews, going to parliamentary inquiries, writing submissions, presenting evidence, doing this time and time and time again, because as a federated country, all the states have their own different road rules. We've had to do this repeatedly. So this has taken so far 6 years, and the level of momentum and energy to get this change to happen it's enormous. It's really hard to sustain. But this is where we're at. 2013, it was just a guideline everywhere. 2016, it had changed. 3 of the jurisdictions had changed it into a road rule, and we had a 4th state that had it as a trial. Then by this year, everything's kind of pink. So the light pink is a trial, the darker pink, the road rule's been changed, except Victoria. And yes, if you've made that connection, I am from Victoria. So they're still holding out. Happy to have that discussion. We're recording, aren't we? Happy to have that discussion later. Still a guideline. We'll talk about that later. 2 last ones I want to quickly fit in before I finish. Deliveroo. I'm not sure if you have Deliveroo here. It's kind of like Uber Eats, but on bikes. It's like a bike delivery system. It's a bike delivery for food. We have it in Australia. We have a few of them. We have Uber Eats, we have Fedora, we have Deliveroo. And it's an industry that's not got a really good reputation in Australia. And you can see here some of the footage that's been shown on Australian TV of those food delivery riders riding through tunnels, riding through spaces cyclists just should never be. And it's really associated with high-risk behaviour, but also with a really transient workforce, a lot of international students, a lot of people who are doing the kind of gig economy work. So we talked to Deliveroo, who's one company, and they were really surprisingly receptive. They said, okay, well, help us. Tell us, how can we do this better? So work with the foundation, we asked this question, well, what can Deliveroo do to improve safety for their riders who are on bikes? And we undertook a really comprehensive review of all of their onboarding process, and we came up with a list of 39 different recommendations. I won't go through them now, but they were all involved in that sort of very front end, just starting out in the job. Covered things like what they were actually asking them to do online, their rider assessment, they took them out on an on-the-road test to see how they could ride, what their onboarding presentation looked like, and their equipment. And I'm really pleased to say that out of that work, 26 of those recommendations have been implemented. They were really receptive. They really wanted to get this right. So I think for us, there's often an us and them, they're doing the wrong thing approach with practitioners or with industry, and that really wasn't the case here. And those recommendations that they didn't take up immediately in Australia, it's because they weren't able to. So their global office is in London, and they've instigated a review there of some of those safety features that we had identified, and doing a global review of their equipment and how they work as an international operation. They also wanted to continue discussions with Google, because Google Maps is what people were often using, and that was sending the cyclists through the tunnel. So getting Google involved to work out ways to make sure that those tunnels weren't included on the maps is another outcome from this study for Deliveroo. And I have one final project to talk about, and I've talked for too long, so I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to let Jamie tell you about it, and Phoebe. So Jamie is no one's coming in. It's just going to be me. Jamie is the project manager for Rail Projects Victoria, the state government, and Phoebe Dunn. Phoebe is the CEO of the Amy Gillett Foundation, and I'll let them talk to you about this current project. Sharing road safety is something that I'm really excited about. I've been involved as the main developer of the content of the course in Australia, and I'll leave it with them to tell you about it.
Today's about the start of one element of some of the project to improve public safety. So we realised that we're building a city-shaping project, but we have to share the city and share the roads at the same time. We've got a lot of trucks that move in and out of the CBD, and clearly there's a lot of cyclists and pedestrians in the same area.
What Rail Projects Victoria commissioned us to do is to produce a training program to help keep everyone safe on our roads.
We went and benchmarked the best practice in the world. So for us, that meant the UK. We looked at what's been done over there in London, but also in the UK on major transport building projects like Crossrail.
So this training program is designed to raise awareness of the vulnerability of vulnerable road users on our roads. And that is cyclists, motorcyclists and pedestrians.
We've deliberately, for this pilot, we wanted real drivers because we wanted to get candid feedback about course, about all elements of it.
Well, normally my day job is I drive for Toll Express and I drive B-doubles locally doing palletised general freight.
Truck drivers are professional drivers. The road is their workplace and they're very adept at understanding the risks associated with the road.
We started the day just talking broadly in a workshop session, I guess, about what do they see on the road? Do they have stories they can share?
It was good to get different perspectives and opinions from other truck drivers, and it was good to just sort of flesh out some ideas of how we can solve some of the problems around vulnerable road users.
And then we took them out on bikes on the road. So that it's an experiential part of the program where truck drivers get to experience what it feels like from the vulnerable road user perspective.
I know some of them had ridden before quite recently, but some haven't ridden a bike for a very long time, so it's been good for all of them.
For me, the last time I rode a bike would have been probably back in 1977, right? So that's quite a while away. So this was all coming back to me as we're driving along.
So we had a couple of what's called Cycle certified instructors out leading the ride today and providing information to the truck drivers when they were out on their bikes.
It really does bring to light how many people are buzzing around these projects and the amount of things that drivers need to take into account. Pedestrians walking on the footpath on their phones, cyclists buzzing around the joint, not so much aware of their surroundings.
Being mainly a truck driver, I could see where my driving past them or near them would impact a great deal on their ability to be able to ride. So yeah, it just sort of just opened up my eyes a little bit to that.
There's no experience the same as actually being on the bike and having those vehicles come past you from behind for the first time to understand how exposed you are.
I reckon this is a brilliant idea. I reckon it should be made compulsory for all CBD jobs because it really does. It makes you start thinking about what would happen if you were in their position.
So it is a requirement on our projects that all the heavy vehicle drivers will attend this training.
Rail Projects Victoria expect to see around 2,000 truck drivers undertake this program in the next couple of years.
We can't call ourselves a successful project unless we protect and improve the safety for the public as they move around our works and our vehicles.
Come with an open mind and come prepared to contribute ideas and opinions.
So that's that project. So I'm happy to talk to you more about it, but I think I'm just about out of time. So I want to close with 2 quick advertisements because I'm here and I can. First one is that we are recruiting for PhD students. Sorry, Jennifer, I'm going to steal some. Anyone online, hi. That we have 16 PhD scholarships open in injury prevention at Monash. So applications are open until the 2nd of November. And we're looking for people interested in doing interdisciplinary research. So it could be in transport, but it could also be in the workplace or in the community. And the last one is last week, the International Cycling Safety Conference was in Barcelona. So that was last week. Next year, it's going to be in Australia, in Brisbane, and calls for abstract for that conference are open now. So if you are interested in coming to Australia, that might be your opportunity to come in November. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
We have 8 to 9 minutes for questions, and so people can raise their hands. Who's monitoring me online? Okay.
How did you get the drivers to participate in that little bike tour around town?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It was an interesting process. It took about 2 years from start to ride. There's a lot of construction work going on in Melbourne at the moment. So we're extending the metro rail system. So building 5 new underground stations and removing 50 level crossings around the metropolitan area. So the government recognised that with that increase in truck movements, the likelihood of there being a fatality crash was increased considerably. So the government really wanted there to be a change. Part of the package of work that's going on is about improving the safety of the truck itself, but this was focusing on the driver. It took about 8 months of consultation and collaboration with industry to finally get their sign-off. It was a lot of discussion. There was a lot of pushback. People thought that drivers would be exposed to too much risk, that they didn't want their riders out there. What if their drivers out there, what if someone came off, and what would then happen for them in a work capacity? Just a lot of conversations, a lot of legal protections, waivers, route assessments, making sure that this was a short route. They actually ended up riding 3 kilometres in total. So as Jamie mentioned, it's based on the program in the UK where it's a 3-hour ride on road. That's their experience. So we've had to reduce it quite a lot. And it was just a negotiation between us and the industry.
Actually, a follow-up on that. Is it now, does the government who's contracting to do all of this work, do they require it now? So as part of the once you did all of that work to set the program up, now it's a requirement.
So it was in 2016 that we all came together. There were 90 people who came into the room and said, how do we make sure that all these extra trucks on the road don't lead to increased fatalities? And at that time, the contracts were going out, the tenders were going out to say, come and do work on those major projects. It's not stipulated in the current round of contract that that's required, but it will be going forward, and this will be the course that they have to do. And then given the federated states approach in Australia, the intention to longer term is to make sure that that certification applies nationally so that it isn't a state by state requirement, and that certification means that they could then work on all different projects so they don't keep needing to requalify. So it's just trying to make it simpler and smarter so it's easier.
So I have a question from online from Bradley. He's asking about the Meter Matters program. Now that it's become law in various places in Australia, are you seeing or feeling any improvements in safety from the implementation of the program, and also who enforces or monitors the program?
Okay. So the first part about the changes, yes, we are seeing changes. So we're seeing changes. Usually when the law changes in the state, there's quite a lot of information that goes out around it. It's a lot of awareness, and there's a much higher awareness of the need to give that minimum passing distance than before the law was changed. That's been seen in every state and territory that it's been introduced in. And drivers and cyclists in different evaluations are reporting that they feel they've been given more space. So yes, that's definitely happening. Narelle Howarth, who I mentioned earlier from Cars Q, she's been doing some evaluations of the law change in different states and finding that that change is consistent and continuing. In terms of who enforces it, yeah, that's really tricky. The police enforce it, and how they do that is usually by if they directly observe it, they can definitely enforce it. Sometimes it comes with a warning rather than a penalty. And there's it's kind of still an evolving space in terms of using any other means. So whether it's reported by the cyclist or whether it's something that they've video recorded, it varies very much between states. And that's probably our next focus, is how do we make sure that it's enforced. Hi.
For the case of the truck driver who unfortunately ended up with the accident of the cyclist. So if it were law and not just a guideline, what would the outcome have been in that trial?
Yeah, he would have been found guilty of that offence, but as I said,
it's not a major, it doesn't come with a major penalty. So it was really more that obviously.
We didn't want someone who was involved in a fatality crash to just walk away without any consequence. So it wasn't necessarily about having anyone incarcerated as a result of that event. But what we also have found through this whole process is that the education element of changing the legislation and putting that topic out into the public conversation has been a huge benefit to changing the law in a much greater way than just doing an education campaign ever was. So not as severe an outcome as we didn't necessarily need it to be severe. We just needed it to be something. Hi.
Hi. When you were talking about the e-bikes and you said that people felt they were safer because of their geometry, what we'd call like a cruiser, where you sit upright. Is there any evidence whether that is, or I didn't catch if it was a perception or evidence-based reality?
It's a perception.
Okay.
It's completely a perception. And especially older males who I spoke to, so I interviewed all of the e-bike riders who were involved in the first study that we did, which involved a trial part of it. This was the first time that they'd actually sat in an upright position on a bike. So they were talking about having a lot more sort of, it's not really peripheral vision, but they were looking around a lot more than they would if they were raked forward on road bike bars. So it was really a perception more than something that's been tested.
Are cruisers pedal bikes? Are they not popular? I feel like here they kind of evoke a little nostalgia, and Portland bikes everything nostalgic. But is there just not that like nostalgic appeal in Australia?
So for us, it's changing now, but for us for a really long time, the majority of people riding bikes were riding for sport and for fitness. So they were riding long distances, they were riding quite high spec road bikes in Lycra, often in large groups, and that's kind of the main, they're at that strong and fearless end because there's just not enough infrastructure. Mm-hmm. So we have this stereotype in Australia that that's what a cyclist is. In the urban areas where there's more hipsters, then you will see more kind of upright bikes, but it's not the dominant sense of oh, you're nodding. That would kind of make you like a hipster. But yeah, so it's changing. I've just finished a study on one particular section of road in Melbourne where I've been filming cyclists at two particular intersections for 10 years. And we have 10 years of footage of them going in and out. And it's changed in terms of the number of people who are cycling, but also the types of bikes that people are riding. And there's been a real shift away from Lycra. So at the beginning, it was a lot of men all on road bikes, mainly riding Lycra. And now it's not just shifted to there being more women and more upright bikes, but also more guys not on road bikes and not in Lycra. So it's changing. Hi.
Hi. I was really interested in that, the one regarding Deliveroo and how this service can provide extra safety for these people who are delivering for them. I think that's especially really important as we get more shared devices like the Nike bikes and these skips where we're giving so many different alternative driving methods to people who don't necessarily know how to do it safely. Has there been like a follow-up to see how that's helped with Deliveroo and maybe improved your guys' bike share or, kind of like crossover?
I'm not sure about the crossover. In terms of the Deliveroo, it's really new. The changes from the recommendations are this year.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it's too new to know if it's had an impact. What we found when we reviewed their onboarding process was that it had grown quite organically in Australia. So they'd kind of grabbed the training approach from the UK, put it into Australia, and then each state had added a little bit. So when we looked across the approach nationally, there were a lot of gaps, a lot of missing information. So their first task really was to just get it all sort of organised and making sure everyone was getting the right information. But then beyond that, it was a bit patchy what they were doing. And like most things, it was dependent on who was involved at that time. So people who had more of a safety sort of experience or understanding were doing those on-road tests, they would focus more on that. So it's just making sure that that's consistent. But yeah, it's still too soon to tell if it's had an impact yet.
Great, that's all we have time for.
Great, thank you.
I gotta finish reviewing the chapter. You joining us for lunch? Yes. Good. We're not pointing the wrong way. Back to the urban center and 11.